let's do a shot of that. Pure peace and tranquility. Okie dokie. It is the 8th, no it's not, it's the 10th of February 2023. I've lived roofless and off-grid for over a year. I don't ever want a roof in Britain. Well, temporarily to get this done properly might be acceptable, but I don't recognise this society. Righty-ho. Because I live off-grid, my one problem in life is I do not have enough electricity to edit videos. It takes a long time. So I'm going to have to do this in little spurts. In a few weeks, I'm going to launch a Kickstarter to try and get some funding for the initial phase of just grabbing a bit of footage of some moments. And those moments will be in Portugal, maybe a few elsewhere. Now, for a long time, I've known forget children, forget. I'm going to talk about drugs. I have no interest in drugs. Forget drugs, or rather, drugs is a small part of what's going to follow. That, by the way, only crystallized in me yesterday morning. I shall explain that later. The last decade I've been more interested, I suppose, in the environment. And the environment means truth to power in respect of holding large conglomerate businesses to account, holding governments to account. Now I'm sat in England here. Wales is only a mile away, thank God, meaning I'm in England. In Wales they have different law regarding the environment, and it seems that it's going to be yet another SOP. So there's a whole range of things in life where the ordinary person may have to give it to the man. And I know for a fact that for a few years in the mid double O's, from 2003 to 2005, but 6 really, I gave it to the man with such aplomb, but spirited, and there was even some fun in it. I could never have imagined a few years earlier doing that, and in fact, for the only time in my life in 35 years, in 2002, for a few months I was so hurt that I could only partially function. In fact, I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Now, I'm only making this because I've been, I don't know what the right word is, but I've been inspired in meeting one person who's not British and who is, to some extent, although I don't think she realises how truly, truly fascist-like Britain can be. She's sceptical about certain aspects of Britain. The structure. We can use the big word, the demos, society. The ordinary life. Well, it's not the ordinary life. It's the way the citizen lives But then there's a problem. When the citizen comes up against authority, often that authority pretends that it's there to help you, so often not. Anyway, by encountering this person, I have myself, it's not her fault, realized that total openness about everything is just, I was 95% open. But total openness is such a lovely feeling inside. In 2002, prior to heading off on my little holiday that ended up with me spending 6 months fighting the authorities, and everybody said, prison governors said, you should get bail, mister. I hadn't even had a parking ticket in the past. Anyway, the 9 months prior to that, for the only time in my life, I couldn't get it up when somebody, it came about most curiously, a woman who I really liked, 2 or 3 years on from a separation from the mother of my child for the first time, somebody I really liked, and we had a healthy, she was my equal. Anyway, she worked for me occasionally. It was a sort of ruse for us to spend time together. Out of the blue, it's the only time it's ever happened in my life. This woman I really did like a lot threw herself at me. Take me, I'm yours. Paradise. Except it wouldn't work. That's, and it's kind of one of the worst things to happen in life. Yep, there she was, naked. It wouldn't work. And that's one of the things that, well, 6 months prior to the events that precipitated the what I know should be in a feature film, to show people, to guide people, just guide them. Hey, I don't have a formal education. I had a formal vocation career for 20 years as a professional pilot, but that's not really a formal education. It's much more slapdash than you might assume. Anyway, I want to get into the point. So, because I don't have video editing, I have to really hurry through this. Yeah, so that's how bad it is when you are faced with a tyranny. Because that's what I was faced with. I had no idea. And the worst tyranny of all is when the woman who you hire, having looked around the local market town carefully, interviewed 3 or 4 different lawyers, the one you are sure is the right one, there she is. She has her guardian in her, on her desk in her quite dowdy office. Good sign. Not a showy person. Serious woman. So that is the lady I took on to be a lawyer in a minor matter. But when your lawyer is answering letters that are different letters to the ones you sent her, that's when inside about something that matters, the custody of your child, or the ongoing protection, I should add in, because my daughter pretty much lived with me. When your own lawyer is just on drugs, that's when it really, really, really hurts. And that's when the citizen needs to somehow stand up. And it might take years, it might take decades. And we're talking about in all kinds of fields of life. In fact, I always say my hero is a man, I'd love to know his name. I call him Whole Man. He's a man who, without any education, stood up about 40 years ago. Thatcher privatised the docks in the Hull area, and the private company who gradually took over, although it's of course always more complicated and tricky than that. The private company that took over the pension liability, they managed not to pay the pensions of chaps mainly who'd been working there for 10 or 20 years. Now this guy alone campaigned for 30 years. It took him 30 years. God, it must have been boring. Hardly anyone would give him solidarity and fellowship, and he just plugged away, and eventually, I think it was about 10 or 11 years ago, he succeeded. Those pensions were retrospectively awarded. The citizen needs to fight, and doing it, having a bit of fun while you're doing it, is actually quite important, I realised. Otherwise you go nuts, and you can't do it as effectively if you don't have a bit of fun. So this story, there is some fun in it, otherwise I wouldn't be here, because I don't like just a dull documentary style approach to anything. Anyway, let me start at the beginning, and this is going to be so quick. The beginning for me, but it almost sort of ended up as full circle yesterday. The beginning for me, 1991, 1992, I was sort of absorbed into a strange but totally wonderful little household. It was in the centre of London, which I'd had nothing much to do with, but a little household comprising a woman a couple of years older than me, incredibly bright, educated woman. When I met her, when this household sort of began, she was 3 or 4 months pregnant. Anyway, she had 3 kids. Now, technically, this Oxford-educated woman, who I wouldn't even dream of identifying, but her father, very high up in the British military intelligence structure, we're talking Washington level, she had actually, a few months before I met her, committed the same technical breach of the law as I had. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody even dreamed of thinking that she was in the wrong. And she did actually, 2 or 3 years later, end up in child custody court. Eventually it needed sorting out. No judge pointed the finger at her and said, you actually abducted your children. In fact, you could say 3 times worse than the technical breach that I was. I'm not actually going to finish that sentence because I could never get a lawyer. So if you can't get a lawyer who's sane, you hold your hands up and say, I can't fight this because I can't get no lawyer, no barrister came to see me whilst I was on remand. They were asked and they said they were coming, but they didn't. Anyway, to the point, because that's not the point. The point is, in that little household, myself, 1991, 1992, with her, it was not a straightforward thing, but it was brilliant, beautiful, lovely. She had left a the most overbearing Frenchman in the world, and she needed to be away from him, and set up, and I ended up augmenting, and we had a little kind of semi-adopted, semi-refugee, half Serb, half Croat young woman live with us. This was when the former Yugoslav wars were, I'm afraid to say, raging. Anyway, to the point. After about a year, because she needed to rebuild herself, and she needed to be aside entirely. The Frenchman never came. After about a year, we adopted our first joint friends. A woman, I'll name her, Kirsten. She died 10 years ago. And her partner. And her partner was the stepfather from virtually birth to a fantastic little young boy, 3 or 4 years old at the time. Now, slowly, we sort of adopted them. Their kid went to the same day school, whatever you want to call it, pre-nursery, or just a bit of a social as a couple of the kids of my friend. Now, it was quite obvious that Kirsten she was pretty okay, but she'd had a little bit of a beautiful person life of Notting Hill and a little bit of drugs, a little bit of that, but she was a very dedicated mother to her boy. And more importantly, quite astonishingly, the big tall lanky man who was her partner. Now you could tell that he'd had a life, but he was so sweet. He was so dedicated to this boy. And we knew them very well for a year or two. And then one day, there was some bizarre little event. Yes, there was a children's party due to happen. And of course he'd be there. It sort of was a little organic arrangement whereby we, without being too kind of formally intertwined, we'd organically intertwine as 4 adults for the sake of 4 children. Anyway, so there's a child's party due, and this man wasn't there. And I'm like, well, that's sad. He so loves the boy, which he did. Anyway, a bit later that day, when the children had gone, somebody said to me, "Didn't you know, Simon? He's off on a heroin binge." Now, I'd spent a lot of time with this couple for a year. I had no idea. Now, that evening, that day I should say, I'm sure so damaged the day for the little boy, who for the little boy, to all intents and purposes, his dad, I don't know where his dad had been, but wasn't on the scene, had never been on the scene. Anyway, so he'd been let down. Drugs. And I had no idea. And then it transpired that the man was back off and off his heroin binge over the next month or two. I saw him 10 or 15 years later, but randomly at a campsite in West Wales, and he was all right then. But drugs is so... this was a great man. Wonderful, mellow, lovely, gentle, intelligent, not really privileged man. And drugs had so damaged the household. I couldn't believe it. Just so happens that the year that I was collared, in a bizarre best thing that ever happened. Of course, I always thought, I hope it didn't slightly traumatise my kid. But that same year, the film Love Actually came out, where Bill Nye, the character who's the faded rock star who ends up with his accidental almost #1, there's a little scene in there where Nye is on some TV show. Oh yes, I remember. I quite like the film. I'm sounding like a pretentious twat. I'm not a pretentious twat. Anyway, it's with Anton Decker, I think. Now, I haven't had the television for 20 years. So, I wouldn't even recognise him if they walked in here now. But he's doing this provocative thing in front of the camera. and then he twists it around into a line where he says, hey kids, whatever you do, don't buy drugs. So Ant and Dec go, whew. And then the Naya character says, no, become a rock star, and they give you them for free. And that in the film, it's a kids program. And then I'm going to swing it back and then turn this off. But I need a Kickstarter to go. I need 3,000 or 4,000 quid to pay for the so humble, modest expenses of myself and somebody with a camera as I go and look around the places and tell some stories. And maybe that's all I'll ever manage, but they're great stories. They're not stories of British, total, feral, lost, sick, sad society. Bizarrely, in Portugal I met the most wonderful people, full of life force and such dignity. That's a 20-minute section in this film. I don't know if I can find them. I'd like to go and have a look. And a woman who came to visit me in the Portuguese What was it? No, Evora Establishment of Corrections. She died a few years later, but that's not really in the story. But here's the thing. A week or two ago, Pirate Station, I watched the film Aftersun. Now, most of the last 20 years I've been somebody who, let's just say, if I encounter something in the media or in the public which is connected with kids and dads, but this is not about dads, I'll take some interest. And as I'm watching that film, it builds into a scene 3/4 of the way through, which frankly is the worst kind of total dystopian mode to be in as a parent of either gender with an 11-year-old child. I could not believe seeing it. And then I heard yesterday on the Today programme, Radio 4, the stupid presenters praising, more than praising, they were, 3 BAFTA nominations, and the star, the man, was interviewed. They were just, I shan't even say it, licking at his bollocks. I'm sorry, there's a line, the scene within that film where the man is talking to his 11-year-old daughter about drugs is just sorry. Britain does not know what good and bad, right and wrong, thoughtful parenting is. Britain doesn't know anymore. But you see, I knew this 20 years ago. In fact, I knew it 25 years ago, and it's purely as an aside. But the year that my daughter was conceived with the mother, we had an agreement that we're not going to bring the kid up in this country. Now, many times, okay, she broke that agreement. Born, passport, citizenship. After things have settled down, go and establish in Europe. And this has got nothing to do with Brexit, Europe. This is Britain. But yesterday, hearing the eulogizing about this terrible film, it strengthened me, because it reminded me there's just the line in this world. And why do I bring that in? Because this film's about 2004, 5, 6. Because there'll be all sorts of regions of life, aspects of life, for decades to come in this completely mad, lost society, where this citizen is gonna have to fight for their rights, for their freedoms, for whatever. For their children's rights, for their children's freedoms, for a healthy psychological environment. And I know that this is one of the best stories ever about facing impossible odds. I mean, totally impossible. And ending up Goliath